Hello everybody, welcome back to another tier list. Today we're going to be going through the discography of Soft Cell, one of the great synth pop groups to come out of England in the late 70s and early 80s. And for a lot of people, the only song that they know from this group is their big hit Tainted Love. And while that is a great song, I do think that this group has way more to offer beyond their one big hit, because they are a truly unique group with so much depth to their music, and their writing definitely had a dark side to it, which I particularly love. I think it gives their sound a really unique edge, and I think their discography is well worth exploring because Mark Almond and Dave Ball are a magical pairing that I would consider to be two of the great contributors and pioneers of the synth pop movement of the early 80s. So what I'm going to do today is go through their 5 studio albums, going from NonStop, Erotic, Cabaret, up to Happiness Not Included, and I won't be including NonStop Ecstatic Dancing since that is considered a remix album, and it contains a few songs that were on their first record, so it feels kind of weird comparing it to their studio discography since that album is sort of in a category of its own. So I just wanted to address that up front because I'm sure some people will be asking where that album is on this list. But I'm going to go through their 5 studio albums, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 5 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1981 titled NonStop Erotic Cabaret, and I will give this one an S. I think this is an incredible debut record, and I would consider this to be required listening for anybody looking to explore the synth pop genre. They recorded this in New York City, and at that time, a lot of the nightlife revolved around, nightclubs and doing ecstasy, which influenced a lot of the writing on this album. Stylistically, it's very much in that synth pop and new wave sort of hybrid, with an amazing use of electronics and really awesome synth sounds. And lyrically, there's a lot of sleazy subject matter being covered, which is something that Soft Cell is very well known for. But there's also some deep and reflective tracks on here as well, tackling a variety of different subject matters that involve the human condition. The album is 10 tracks long, and one of the things that I love so much about this record is that it contains all of those electronic dance elements that you would hear in club songs from the 80s, but it also has a serious dark edge to it and ventures off into some really mysterious and ominous places, which is something that I think has always been unique about Soft Cell's writing and really makes them stand out in comparison to a lot of other synth pop groups of the time. Side 1 gives us 5 incredible tracks that all complement one another very nicely, opening up with Frustration, which brings things in with a great energy but also has some mysterious elements to it, and then that is followed by Tainted Love, which is obviously the song that Soft Cell is most well known for, and it's actually a cover song, with the original recording being done by Motown artist Gloria Jones in 1965, and the idea of doing this cover had come from Dave Ball and is pretty much entirely responsible for them being as famous as they are. And obviously it goes without saying that this is an incredible interpretation of that song, but it's actually not my number one favorite track on this album. There are a couple of other tracks that I do like even more. Track 3 then goes into some more chill territories with CD Films, and that brings us into that more sleazy subject matter that Soft Cell is so well known for. And then that is followed by my personal favorite song from this record titled Youth. Such a powerful and intense song with a really ominous sort of mood to it. I love the synth sounds being used. The vocal melodies are great, and they can get pretty tense in the second section. And the lyrics are just a very sad commentary on, your youth slipping away from you. Just an incredible track that would easily be one of my favorite Soft Cell songs. Then side 1 concludes with Sex Dwarf, which has such incredible synth sounds going on between the Korg synth bass and the chords and lead parts on top of it, which has such incredible synth sounds going on between the Korg synth bass and the chords and lead parts on top of it. And the music video for this song actually ended up getting banned because it had pretty edgy subject matter, and it's just a rock solid track to conclude side 1 on. Then we go into side 2, which delivers another solid 5 tracks, opening up with Entertain Me, which would be my second favorite track on here. Another song with a real darkness and intensity to it, and the vocal melodies being doubled in the synth on the chorus creates such a powerful feeling. Another one that would make my list of favorite Soft Cell tracks. Then we go into a more dancey territory with Chips on My Shoulder, and that contrasts the previous song nicely and functions as a nice pick-me-up in mood. And then we have my third favorite track on here titled Bedsitter, another amazing track with really colorful melodies and synth sounds, particularly in the chorus. And as you can see, I do like multiple songs on here more than Tainted Love. Tainted Love would probably be my fourth favorite track on here if I had to rank them. Then we have Secret Life, and this is the one song on this album that I'm sort of indifferent about. I wouldn't say it's a bad track, but for me personally, it is probably the least standout song from this record. And then the album concludes with Say Hello, Wave Goodbye, which wraps things up on a very feel-good and tasteful mood. Another amazing track, and it does a really great job of providing some nice contrasts from everything else on side 2, and it's the perfect closer to this record, in my opinion. So I think they knocked it out of the park with this album. It's got a little bit of everything that Soft Cell has to offer, between the dancey nightclub sorts of vibes that offer a great depiction of what their lifestyles were like at that time, between that and the sleazy subject matter covered on certain songs, and then combining that with the more dark and ominous tracks gives us the full palette of all of the fascinating and edgy and risk-taking sounds that Soft Cell is capable of creating, and I think they just did an amazing job with this record. It's got multiple songs that I would regard as some of my favorite Soft Cell tracks, and like I said, I think this album is required listening for anybody looking to explore the synth-pop genre. So an amazing debut record. I will give this one an S. Alright, next we have their second studio album from 1983 titled The Art of Falling Apart, and this one gets an easy S. I love this record. This one actually goes down as my favorite Soft Cell album. I love everything they did on this one. At this point, they had been fully immersed in the nightlife scene, which consisted of a lot of partying and drug use, and it had caused their mental health to start to suffer, and because of that, they take leaps into even darker territories on this record with a very nihilistic sort of undertone, and they cover subject matters ranging from drugs to promiscuity and deterioration and decay. The album is 8 tracks long, and it opens up with Forever the Same, which is in my opinion the strongest opening track of any Soft Cell album, and would probably be my favorite track on this album. I love the energy and intensity of this song. I think it's the perfect track to just immediately grab the listener's attention and kickstart this amazing record. Then it goes into Where the Heart Is, which is a mid-tempo song with sad lyrics about parents not having a great relationship and the effect that it has on the kids. An amazing follow-up track. And then we go into another great song titled Numbers, which was one of the hits from this record and is one of the tracks to cover the topic of promiscuity. I love the mood of this track. The synth sounds are so awesome, and the combination of the synth tones, the groove, and the chord choices creates such a vibey and moody track. Then they continue with another song about promiscuity titled Heat. This one takes a more dark mood with more eerie and ominous synth sounds, and the theme of this one is centered around the heat of the night, and I think the music perfectly encapsulates that dark nighttime sort of imagery. A very intense and dark song that I just love so much. Then the mood completely shifts with Kitchen Sink Drama, which is a very pretty piano-centered pop ballad about a housewife with a prescription drug addiction. Another sad song with the piano providing some great melancholy textures that complement the mood perfectly. And then we go into Baby Doll, which is a song about a stripper, and to me this is the track from this record that really clearly illustrates the mental health struggles that were happening during the making of this record. This song has some truly terrifying moments, and to me it just perfectly encapsulates a group that was in the middle of some sort of mental health crisis, and I just absolutely love the dark moods that these guys are capable of creating. And like I said before, I think it really gives their music an edge to it that a lot of other synth pop groups do not have. Then they change gears and go into a mid-tempo synth pop track titled Loving You, Hating Me, which is a love song about a battle within a relationship and the pain that comes with that. A beautiful track and a complete contrast from Baby Doll, and I really like some of these more extreme changes in mood from track to track, and I think that it perfectly fits with the theme of everything starting to fall apart for them them as a band and also with their mental health. Then the album concludes with the title track, The Art of Falling Apart, which is probably the most driving and dancey song of this record, but still has that dark edge to it in the chorus, and it's basically a commentary on where they were as a band at that time, and it's a great closer to just an absolutely amazing and unique record. In my opinion, everything on here is great. They didn't hold anything back on any of these tracks and weren't afraid to go into some very taboo and uncomfortable subject matters, and gave a very honest portrayal of where they were mentally at that time, and produced an amazing batch of 8 very different and very unique songs that all serve an important role in this Art of Falling Apart theme that was culminated by their partying and drug use that had started and continued from the time they had arrived in America. So an amazing record, my number one favorite Soft Cell album. This one gets an easy S. Moving on, we have their third studio album from 1984 titled This Last Night in Sodom, and I will give this one an A. I think this is another very good album, but I would consider it to be a very slight downgrade from the first 2 records. This album was written during the most self-destructive stage for both Mark and Dave. Everything was falling apart within their personal lives, and also because of issues with their record company, and this would be their last album for almost 30 years, and they would announce that they were splitting up shortly before the record came out. Stylistically, this one goes into some different directions with very little pop remnants, and now incorporating some industrial and post-punk sounds, and this record would end up being an influence on bands like 9 Inch Nails. It is 10 tracks long with 5 songs on each side, and right from the beginning you see where they are at with the opening track Mr. Self-Destruct, which is an awesome high-energy track that brings in the album very nicely. I particularly love the synth sounds on the chorus of this one. I think in terms of the different types of synths being utilized, I think they get some of the most unique sounds on this record. Then we go into Slave Like This, which stylistically goes into that industrial territory, and that sound was very radical and ahead of its time for 1984, and I really appreciate that about this record. I think it's very daring. Then they go into Little Rough Rhinestone, which is one of the more poppy tracks on this record, but lyrically it is a very sad commentary on feeling disconnected and isolated from people. After that, it goes into Meet Murder My Angel, which is a song about a toxic relationship, and it's got this really eerie chord progression that creates this feeling of discontent and tension, which fits the lyrical content of this song beautifully. Then side 1 closes with The Best Way to Kill, which is again more in that industrial territory, and while I appreciate this song from a stylistic perspective, it is one of a couple of tracks on here that I'm not crazy about. In my opinion, it is one of the weaker songs on the record, but I can still appreciate it from a stylistic standpoint and how ahead of its time it sounded for 1984. Side 2 then opens up with by far my favorite track from this record. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this track. I'm not exactly sure how to say it, but I'm just going to go with El Escuelita. I know it's based off of a drag bar in New York City from the 80s, but this is an over 7-minute track that is so dark and so mysterious. That main synth melody that's doubled with the female vocal part is so badass and intense, and I love that it serves as sort of a main theme of the track and pops up a lot throughout the song, and the sax solo is also a very nice surprise. Easily my favorite song from this record, and it would also make my list of favorite Soft Cell songs. And again, another song to me that completely captures the dark times that Mark and Dave were going through. After that, we have my least favorite song on here titled Down in the Subway. This is a pretty hard song to categorize stylistically, but I just find it really boring compared to everything else on here, and I think it feels out of place next to all of these other dark and intense tracks. And this track and The Best Way to Kill are the main reasons why I put this in A tier rather than S tier. The remainder of side 2 is very strong though, with Surrender to a Stranger, my second favorite song on here. I absolutely love the synth sounds. It reminds me of early video game music, and the song just has a great energy to it. Then we have Soul Inside, and this is an interesting song for me because I've never found the first half of the song that exciting, but the entire second half of the track gets so intense and builds so beautifully. So it's one of those songs I normally just listen to for the second half. I think that's the big payoff part of the track. And then the album concludes with another very dark track titled Where Was Your Heart When You Needed It Most, which is the perfect song to conclude this album and end this chapter of the Soft Cell story. It also has some very nice piano parts from Dave Ball at the very end, which to me is just the perfect way to conclude this song and this very intense album. So I do think about 85% of this album is incredible. I like how they go deep into the trenches and portray a really sad depiction of a band that is really just hanging on by a thread. I just think there are a couple of tracks on here that aren't the strongest, and that is ultimately why I bumped it down a tier and put it in A. But the good songs on here are still great, and there are definitely some really standout tracks like El Esquelita, Surrender to a Stranger, Slave to This, and Meet Murder My Angel. And it goes without saying that the industrial and post-punk elements on this record were very ahead of their time, and this record should definitely be applauded for being a key contributor to those styles of music and being influential to many different groups in years to come. So a very good album. I will give this one an A. Okay, next we have their fourth studio album from 2002 titled Cruelty Without Beauty. This was their reunion album and their first record in almost 20 years. In the 90s, both Mark and Dave had become sober, and then after reuniting, they had started writing some stuff and decided that they should put it into a new album, which resulted in this record. As far as scoring goes, unfortunately, I'm going to give it a C. I don't think this is a super strong album. There are some elements of it that I like, and it does have a handful of songs that I do think are really solid, but if I'm comparing it to the previous three records, I wouldn't say that it reaches the same highs that any of those three albums did, and I think the majority of the songs on here are lacking that edge and those unique and daring elements that made the music on their first three records so interesting to listen to. It's 12 tracks long, and at 54 minutes in length, I do think it is a little bit longer than it needs to be. I think they could have trimmed it down to maybe 9 or 10 songs, and it could have been a bit better. And for me, the album basically consists of a chunk of songs that I think are just okay, a couple of songs that I love, and then a couple of songs that I really don't like. And I would say about maybe 65 to 70% of the tracks on here are fine, but I wouldn't say any of the songs on here are as strong as the good songs from their first three records. For me, the high points of this album would be the tracks Darker Times, Monoculture, The Night, which is a fascinating Frankie Valli cover and probably my favorite song from this record, and I also really enjoy Last Chance and Sensation Nation. To me, those tracks would be the most unique and most melodically catchy songs of the record. As far as songs that I think are okay but aren't anything special, I would go with Together Alone, Desperate, Caligula Syndrome, and On and Up. Nothing is necessarily wrong with any of these tracks, but I do think they are pretty generic sounding and don't stick out very much if I'm comparing it to the tracks from the first three records. And the two songs on this record that I could definitely do without are Le Grand Guignol and All Out of Love. I think if they took those two tracks off of the album, it probably would have improved it at least a little bit. So this record does have a handful of strong tracks that I do like, but unfortunately in between those songs, we have a bunch of songs that I think are just okay, a couple of skip-overs, and to me just the ratio of good to not so good songs on this record is just too out of balance to justify giving it a better score. So it pains me to score this one so low. I wish it was a better reunion album, but like I said, I just think the first three records were so awesome and unique for the time that they were recorded that it's pretty hard to replicate and match up to those same standards in the context of writing music in 2002. So not the best reunion album in my opinion. This one gets a C. Okay, and lastly, we have their fifth and most recent studio album from 2022 titled Happiness Not Included, and I will give this a B. I think this album is pretty good, but I wouldn't say it's amazing. I do think it's a slight upgrade from Cruelty Without Beauty. This is their first record they put out in 20 years, another very long gap between records, and some of the inspiration for this record came from the COVID pandemic and all of the added free time that they had on their hands, which freed Dave up to write more music and allowed Mark to experiment with more lyric writing. It's 12 tracks long, and I do have similar critiques about this record that I did with the previous release, where I do think it's a tad long at 55 minutes in length. Again, I do think it could have been trimmed down to 9 or 10 tracks instead of 12 and would have been a bit better. It still has a handful of songs that I'm not crazy about, but I do think the good songs on here stand out a little more than the songs that I liked on Cruelty Cruelty Without Beauty. So that's my main reason as to why I bumped this one tier higher than the previous release. I absolutely love the way it opens up. I think the first 4 tracks are pretty much perfect, starting with Happy, 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 which is a nice eerie and ominous track that kicks things off in that classic dark, soft cell fashion. I also love the follow-up track titled Polaroid, another very cool and vibey song. Then we go into one of the singles from this record, Bruises on All My Illusions, another song with a very dark edge to it and a really catchy chorus. And then we have another single featuring the Pet Shop Boys titled Purple Zone. I absolutely love this track, probably my favorite song from this record. And believe it or not, Mark wasn't sure if he wanted to include this song on the album, and I'm so glad that he did. He thought it sounded a little too much like the Pet Shop Boys, but I think this collaboration went over really well. And I would say the opening 4 tracks are the high point of the record. The remaining 8 tracks have a handful of songs that I enjoy, and then a couple that I'm not crazy about. I think Heart Like Chernobyl, I'm Not a Friend of God, and New Eden are all really solid tracks, but I've never been able to really get into Light Sleepers, the title track, Happiness Not Included, Nostalgia Machine, Nighthawks, and Tranquilizer. I know a couple of those were the other singles, but for whatever reason, they just don't resonate with me as much as the other singles, which were Bruises on All My Illusions and Purple Zone. But this record definitely has a handful of amazing tracks, and I would say a good chunk of the other songs are still solid, just a few skip-overs here and there that I'm not crazy about. But like I said with the previous release, I think it is almost impossible to relive the glory days of 80s soft cell, and I think a large reason why is because the stuff that they were writing at that time was really radical and stylistically went into a lot of uncharted and unexplored territories for the early 80s, and it's pretty much impossible to replicate those sorts of feelings 40 years later when music has evolved into so many new territories and directions. But in the context of a soft cell reunion album after 20 years of nothing, I do think this record is pretty good, and like I said, a slight improvement upon Cruelty Without Beauty. So I will give this one a B. Alright, we did it. We went through their 5 studio albums, and these were the scores I came up with. This is a very fascinating discography to go through because you have the initial 3 records, which shows the progression of the group breaking down and falling into some bad mental places and producing some really dark and awesome music that is giving a very real portrayal of a band venturing deeper and deeper into chaos, and very few bands offer the listeners a look into their troubles in such a truthful way, and it's one of the things that makes soft cell contributions to the musical world and to the genre of synth pop so unique and so edgy, and I think their discography is well worth exploring, and it has so much more to offer beyond, their big hit Tainted Love, which is what a lot of people only know them for. So if you haven't checked this band out, I would highly recommend doing so. I do not think you will be disappointed. And that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was enjoyable, and if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the description, and see if there's anything else that you might like. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 5 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that is it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.